Okay, I'm making a video here that shows the different parts and different items that are in a church sanctuary, the main worship space of a church. This is sort of a show and tell for those who might not know what all the things are. Some worship spaces have very few of these things in. Some worship spaces have a lot of really specialized items. So I thought I would just finally get a little tour done. I'm filming this on my phone, woohoo, in the modern era. So it's a little bit of bouncing around when I'm walking, but I'll try and do it right. Okay, I'm starting here in the entryway to the main worship space here at First Lutheran Church in Nashville, and you might be able to hear all the traffic that's going by. It's a pretty noisy downtown environment, but that's why this, in a way, it's a good illustration of why the worship space is called a sanctuary. It's a place of refuge. I'll talk about that more in a minute. This is really, you might call this a foyer. The proper word for this is a narthex, Narthex. It's sort of like the foyer. It's the entryway, the space before the space. And so often, as our church does, it's a place to gather and have coffee hour and put up notices and name tags and stuff like that. All the stuff that's sort of business-like or stuff that people want to gather and get together, but it's not really part of worship. So now we're going to walk into the main sanctuary space. And you can see this is a big church building or a big space. This space is called the sanctuary because in medieval times, and actually going all the way back to Roman and Greek times, temples, religious places, were considered places of sanctuary. If you were pursued unjustly or pursued by the law and you wanted somebody to plead your case, you could run into a temple. And this was also true with churches once Christianity took hold. You could run into a temple and stay there, and nobody could come in and grab you and drag you away or take you for trial or beat you up or anything. It was a place of safety, sanctuary. And that word sanctuary has come to mean a place of refuge or safety. This space is also called the nave because nave is from the Latin word navus for ship. And you can see that the roof of this particular church does look like the upside down hull of a ship. That was a really important plot point in the Robin Williams film, What Dreams May Come. The idea of being in an upside down ship. But the churches that were built in the Middle Ages, the great Gothic cathedrals, a lot of them had these kind of vaulted roof construction that looks like it's the same kind of construction that you would use in a wooden sailing ship, just turned upside down, turned the other way. So this holds up the roof. We don't have any flying buttresses or anything like that. This is modern construction. But it's a big space. And right now we're just with the narthex at my back. So this was people would walk in, generally this big front door behind me, into the narthex and then into the sanctuary. This sanctuary is filled with pews. Those are the seats that people sit in during worship. I'm always trying to get people to sit further up front so that they can hear the music and stuff better. And a lot of times people are like, no, I'm cool sitting in the back, out of the way. So it's a pew. I don't know why it's called a pew. In medieval churches, there would have been no pews. You would have, if you were wealthy, you would have had your servant bring a stool along with you. But this would have been a really wide open space. You can see that kind of thing in the movie A Knight's Tale when he rides his horse into the cathedral, chasing after the girl, and he doesn't realize he's in a cathedral. And the reason that there's so much space for a horse is because these places to sit would not have been there in the Middle Ages. Let's see, right here by my side is the baptismal font. This could look very different in different churches. In a Baptist church, a traditional Baptist church, this might be a whole separate little room off to itself that's kind of like a hot tub size or even bigger, a pool where people are baptized. In Lutheran practice, we don't immerse somebody entirely in the water. Some churches even go out to a river or a pond and do baptism there. Baptism is when a person is sort of brought into the religious family. It's seen as a rebirth through water, and it's based on events in the New Testament in the life of Jesus. The baptismal font in this particular case is made up of two parts, and the reason in our case that we have this sort of construction is this smaller part here has German words around it. Ein Herr, ein Glaub, and ein Tauf. One Lord, one belief, one baptism. This stone font came from the church building from this congregation in the 1800s. And then when they moved to the new building here in 1951, they took this font and repurposed it into this kind of thing. And so as the congregation moved away from being a German-speaking congregation, which it was originally, then of course now it's an English-speaking congregation. It has been for the rest of its history. They added the English onto this part of the font. So when there's a baptism, the pastor stands here and usually holds the baby, or has the parents hold the baby, and then pours a little water over the baby's head with the words of baptism. Sometimes people will come into the church and will touch their fingers to the water and make the sign of the cross on themselves, on their forehead, to remember their own baptism. This candle is a special candle that you'll see in Lutheran churches and Catholic churches and Episcopal churches. It's called the Paschal candle. You might translate that as the Easter candle. It's the special candle in the church that says that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and he's sort of you'd say, well, is this like for Easter when we celebrate Christ's resurrection? Yeah, we also light it at other important holiday times. Okay, let's see. What else can I show you? Here in the back of the church, we have other things that are a little unusual for a Lutheran church. We have some candles that people can light if they want to have a sort of a private prayer for themselves. Sometimes we get visitors that come and they want to light a candle in honor or memory of someone. Our big candle holder, again, came from, we think, the old church. We think it was a outdoor lantern that was hanging outside, and we've painted it and sort of fixed it up to be a candle holder. So there's different ways that people can have a time for devotion and sort of individual prayer. And we've got things over here that are more like, here's what the church is about, here's what people believe. So Lutherans are certainly into educating people and telling people what's going on. So that's kind of what that is. We see in this church a lot of stained glass windows. People knock on the door all the time asking to come in and look at our stained glass because it's pretty traditional stained glass. Each window shows a picture in the life of Christ, except for the last window, which is sort of like just pretty people praying. There's a lot of symbolism in stained glass windows. I won't go into each window right now. That's for a different occasion, I guess, and not for probably music classes. But it's pretty interesting. We just had our windows cleaned. 6 of these windows came from the old church, and the other 6 were created to match that. In the back of the church, that's the north, looking towards the narthex where we just were. There's a big window there, and that is full of symbolism. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. There we go. All the different shapes and people that are depicted there on the window are all pretty meaningful in Christian symbolism. So that's kind of an important window. The balcony back there is not, we don't use it a lot. The choir does not sit up there for the service, but in some churches, the choir and the organ are in the balcony or the loft at the back. This really is just for extra seating, and our sound equipment is now up there as well. So it's a good place to stream the service from because you're up high, you can see everything. I don't know if you can tell, but it's a lot of hard surfaces. We don't have any carpet on the floor, and there's a lot of reverberation. So this is a really good space for music. It was not designed really as a space where you would just do a lot of speaking. Some churches that are more modern have very dead acoustic spaces because they only amplify sound, but we never we amplify speaking, but I never put a mic on the choir or the organ. If there's a solo, something or other, sometimes we'll do that, but most of the time the sound sounds just fine. Let's see, what else do we have here? You can see we have a piano. I have moved it down here out of the way because we use the pipe organ more in our service than the piano, but I still use it pretty frequently, and I just roll it forward a little bit. Here's another common item in church. This is called a lectern. It's the place from which people will stand and read the different lessons that are from the Bible each week. There's a regular rotation of readings from the Bible, and someone stands there each service and reads it. The hanging on here is white because we're in the season of Easter, so this background color will change depending on the time of the church year. It's white for Easter and Christmas. It's red for Pentecost. It's purple during the season of Lent. It's blue during the season of Advent. And there are usually symbols on these different hangings that are meaningful symbols in religious symbolism. So we have an Easter lily here because it is rebirth and the time of Easter. Let's see, I had somebody ask me what that board thing was. We use a hymnal for people to sing hymns from. And so this board is one way that people know what hymns we're singing. You can see that we just got through the third Sunday in Easter. It sort of is like telling you what, it's like a calendar in a way, but it tells you that in the hymnal there are those numbers. And so our hymnals are in every pew. We don't do projecting stuff. And so people can look up the hymns. And so we might say, well, the first hymn is 366. And so everybody in the service would open their hymnal when it's time, and they would sing from here. Even if they don't read music, they still sing from here. And actually that means that people kind of read music without even knowing it. The hymnal has in it all of the parts of the worship services that we do, although we actually print a bulletin, kind of like a program that has everything in it except the hymns, just to help people out, especially if they can't see very well, if they need large print. So that's the hymnal. Let's see, if we move around right now, we've got this big, huge cross here because it's the season of Easter. This is a tradition just specifically to this church where I am right now. This big tall cross on Easter Day is covered with lily blooms. And so it just all of a sudden is flowering, and we leave it up for the whole season of Easter, which lasts 50 days. Then we take it down and put it away till next year. This tradition's been going on since the 1920s. So it's a big deal for people to come and help stick lily blooms in foam and stick the foam up on the cross. Let me tell you, it's really high. It's kind of terrifying to have to get up there. I did that once. I'm not doing it again. On the other side of the chancel, and we'll talk about why that's called, what that is, the chancel. This is the pulpit. This is the place from which the pastor generally stands. He would stand here to say the sermon, his devotional talk. He would stand here to maybe read one of the 3 lessons that we hear every Sunday. There's another hymn board there. This pulpit is also from the original church as well. So in this case, it's pretty important, and you can actually see a date on there of 1899. So that's pretty cool. Let's see. So this area up front here is called the chancel. The reason it's called the chancel, it comes from the Latin word to sing and to the idea of chanting. Back in the Middle Ages, this would have been where the choir of monks would sit. Now, we don't have monks in this modern day, but the choir still sits right up here in these pews, and I'm over here at the organ so that I can wave my arm while I'm playing. I get one hand free. I can direct them, and they can look at me and sing. This communion rail is pretty traditional in a lot of churches. It's not actually meant to keep the regular people away from the altar, although that certainly is a perception that people have. This rail originally in the Middle Ages, they installed these purely to keep farm animals who might accidentally wander into the church to keep them away from the altar. I really thought that was pretty interesting when I learned that. The way this might work is that you might come up here at the time of communion during the service, and you would kneel here, and then you would hold your hand out, and the pastor would bring a piece of bread, which is part of the communion ritual, or a little cup. If you have a bread, we dip it into the big cup of wine and everybody eats it individually. But some churches have little cups that you have wine in. Pre-COVID, there was a practice that you'd all take a sip from the same big goblet, but we're never ever doing that again. It was kind of gross to begin with, and no. Some churches practice the sacrament of communion every week. Lutherans and Catholics and Episcopalians do that. Some churches do it once a month, like Presbyterians or Methodists, and some churches do it just once or twice a year, maybe Baptists, for example. So this communion is the sort of main focus of Christian worship in the modern era, for sure. We won't talk about medieval practices and abbeys and monasteries doing other kinds of worship that we still do today, but this is kind of the big main service. So the point of communion is to remember first the Last Supper that Christ had with his disciples before he was crucified, but also it is a covenant or an agreement or a series of promises between Christ and Christians, and thus the whole world, as Lutherans believe. It's not just reserved for one set of people. So what happened in the story is that Christ, being Jewish, Jesus being Jewish, sat down to the Passover meal with his friends, and at the end of the Passover meal, he says, wait a minute, I'm not done. There's something important about tonight that I want you to remember. And so there are words that we use that are regular. They're said every time we have communion, and it's telling the story of what Christ did and said. So what we would have here is this chalice or goblet filled with wine or grape juice. We actually have both at our service so that people who are not drinking wine can have the option. Sometimes churches will have these little cups also filled with wine or grape juice. We use those sometimes if we have a lot of people, like on Easter, there's just too many people to deal with just a chalice. So we put these in a little tray, and people just take it and you just drink it. It's kind of like a shot glass. It's less than a shot glass, though. We also have here bread, what represents bread. This is probably the most unappetizing cracker that you could imagine, but it's made with no leavening. There's no yeast or baking soda or baking powder in here to rise the cracker. And that's because it recalls that Jesus was having a Passover meal. At Passover, Jewish people eat at their Seder meal, they eat unleavened bread to remember the unleavened bread that the Israelites ate before they fled out of Egypt ahead of the Egyptians chasing them down. So we, as Christians, coming from that Hebraic tradition, we have unleavened bread, but you also can just do it. Sometimes we have regular bread, and we just break off pieces of regular bread. So it's a symbol, is what it is. This is a bigger wafer. The pastor will hold this wafer up so people can see it a little bit better. I'll show you that in a minute. But then the individual people would get these small wafers. So at any time during communion, people could dunk sometimes the way we do it is that there'll be wine in here and people would dip this in and then eat it. Or the other way is people eat this first and then they go pick up one of these little cups and drink that. And the reason is because of the commemoration or the retelling of the big promise that Christ makes to his disciples and thus to everyone that came about before the crucifixion. So I'll just describe this a little bit for you. I'll give you some of the words. It's a very traditional, regular, happens at every communion service kind of thing. And it's really storytelling. So the pastor repeats these words every time. So he says, "In the night when he was betrayed, Christ Jesus took bread, and having given thanks, he broke it. And the pastor will do this and show everybody. And gave it to his disciples, which is what's about to happen. And said, take this bread and eat it. This is my body. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Different brands of Christianity say, aha, this is the moment when this bread really becomes Christ's body. Other traditions say it's a symbol of Christ's body. Lutherans, the church that I'm in now, say that Christ is in, around, and through this bread. So we're not gonna, we don't say, oh, it becomes flesh and blood. We just say that it's imbued, it's filled with the presence of Christ. So take this and eat it, and remember that I have died for you, and that you are part of my promise of resurrection. And it ends, that little part of the story ends with, do this in remembrance of me. Do this to remember me. Again, after supper, and by the way, eating the Seder bread would have been a normal part, this kind of unleavened bread is a normal part of the Seder observance of Passover. So the idea of breaking off a piece of this unleavened bread and handing it around to people, that's also that's normal in Jewish practice. And so that's kind of what's happening. Then before we do any handing out of bread, the pastor says, again after supper, Christ took the cup of wine when they had finished their supper, and he blessed it. And he said, take this cup and drink from it. This is my blood, which is given for you. Do this for the salvation of many. Do this for the remembrance of me. So this wine, which again would have been present on the table in a Seder meal for Passover, there's always a cup of wine there. He says, take this and drink it, and remember, this is a symbol of my blood that is about to be shed on the cross for everyone. So again, some churches say, yes, this is the blood of Christ. Others say this reminds us of the blood of Christ. Again, Lutherans say it's the presence of Christ is around, in, and through the wine that's in the cup. So then what happens is the pastor and a couple helpers go down from this high up altar place. And in our church, we go right down to the rail there, and people come forward and they get handed a little piece of bread, and then they dip it in the cup of wine, or they get handed a piece of bread, and on big Sundays when we have these little trays of little cups, they pick up a cup, they eat the bread, they drink the wine, and they go back to their seats. But that's kind of a big deal for Christians, because it reminds Christians that we are part of this promise of Christ, that he has redeemed the whole world for whatever is wrong and whatever we've done wrong and anything we can't think of. And even though he was not himself a sinner, he saved us all. So that's the elements of communion. This is called a chalice. This plate is called a paten, not patent, but paten, which is Latin for plate. So there you go. Let's see. So the other people that help out in worship also sit up here in the chancel. Like I say, in some churches, the choir and the organ are in the very back of the church, and so it would just be the people helping out with worship that sit here. Yeah, here's where I sit at the organ, and you can see my organ how-to video another time, but you can see all the keyboards for the organ, and these stops are different sounds. Again, not going to do that. But I have a big version of the hymnal that I play from. I also ring some bells before the beginning of the service. That's actually really a sneaky way of getting people to just be quiet so that I can play my music for the prelude, music before the service. Sometimes in some churches, these bells are rung at the moment of communion. In fact, I bought these bells originally they were from a Catholic church, and that's a tradition in the Catholic church. Okay, sorry for the fast pans. So here we have the altar itself. The altar is the sort of the table. Sometimes it's called a table. It's a holy table. Altars have existed all the way back in Greek and Roman temples and other religions as well. They are sort of special places where special things happen. They're a focus of worship. They're where things kind of come together. So we have another hanging on the altar. This one says Alleluia. It looks a little crooked, so I'll have to straighten it later. It's covered with white linen on the top because this symbolizes the wrappings of linen that Jesus had around him in the tomb. Then when he rose, those wrappings were cast aside in the tomb, and so we use these to sort of remind ourselves of those symbols. And there's crumbs from communion. Let's see. The pastor has a big book that is also the hymnal, but it has all of the particular prayers and things and the different things that he might have to say or chant. It's up to each individual church whether the pastor would sing things or say things. Our pastor likes to do a little bit of both, so it depends sometimes if your pastor can sing or not. It's a big, heavy book, that's for sure. Let's see. We have candles all around that we light at the beginning of the service. It's sort of a sign of like, we're open for business if you want to be a little silly about it. But it's a sign of devotion, and that's pretty normal. Candles, sometimes churches will light incense. And the idea is that as the incense surrounds you, it reminds your senses that you are surrounded by the presence of God. We have this cross here that I think also came from the old church because it's really too big to fit on this ledge. They've got it hooked in with a hook so it doesn't topple over. But I think it came from the old church. It looks kind of older. None of this is real. It's glass, but it's pretty. We put flowers on the altar for almost every service. We try and get the florist to match the colors to whatever hangings are on the altar if I can manage to do that. These are offering plates. At one part of the service, the ushers will come up, the people who help out with worship, and they will hand these around, and people would put money offerings in them that go towards the church ministry and expenses. People can even designate them for special things. So those are offering plates. You can see the organ pipes up here, and there are actually pipes inside that space, and there are pipes on the other side in this space as well. So the organ is really kind of 3D surround sound. That's how it's designed. So that's kind of all the details of what's here. We have in this particular church, it's a little unusual for a Lutheran church to have a big painting of Christ here. This was copied by a local artist from an actual smaller painting. I can't remember who it's by. It says, "Lo, I am with you always." Interestingly, behind this paneling, there are actually unfinished pencil sketches of disciples and stuff, people looking up at Christ as he ascends into the heavens, and they couldn't finish it. They didn't want to finish it, so they put the paneling up instead, which is kind of funny. So that is kind of what it looks like inside a church. Another word that you sometimes hear is the word chapel. And a chapel is really a small church. It could be a small space. Sometimes it's a space that is specialized kind of off to the side in the big sanctuary. So it's kind of in a side aisle, a side passageway there, but connected to the big space. In this church, we have two chapels that are smaller worship spaces, but they're not in the big sanctuary. This happens to be the children's chapel, and I just thought I would show it to you just to sort of see what it looks like in miniature. A lot of times a chapel, whether it's attached to the big sanctuary or off on its own, it will have an altar. This one has a lectern that just sits there. This is the children's chapel. You can tell that by the tiny pews. These are really, really small. And of course, how often do you get stuffed animals hanging out there? Let me show you, we've got another chapel that's a little bit bigger. I can show that to you as well. So this is another chapel space in this big complex. This chapel has always been here with this church, but right now it actually is used by our sister congregation that helps people who are LGBTQIA feel welcome back into church, because often such people have felt really minimized from spaces. So it's a slightly larger space than the children's chapel. In the past, the big congregation has sometimes held services here and sort of squished a few people in, but it's really suited for smaller people. But it also has an altar where communion is celebrated. And you can see this one, their worship practice in this church, this community that worships here is a little more informal because they have a guitar and they have an electric keyboard, and it's just generally designed to kind of make people feel a little bit more at home where they might have felt excluded before, but all the same elements are there. And you can see that even the hymn boards, they have repurposed those. We still have stained glass. These are a different style of stained glass than in the big church. They look a little bit like, whoa, very serious. And so we have some wall paintings as well. And in this chapel, there's a proper little pipe organ up there in the loft. This loft is too small for me to have a whole choir up there if I'm ever doing a service in here. I can maybe fit 1 or 2 people alongside it, but it's pretty squishy up there. It's crammed right in up against the ceiling, you can see. But that's what if you think of that, this is in miniature, that's what some churches have, a big organ in the big loft in the back of the church. But it's really kind of the same. It has a baptismal font, it has an altar, it has pews and hymnals and things like that. So the word chapel often means a smaller space. The word church could mean the building itself, all of the building with all its rooms, or it could mean the sanctuary space that we looked at, the big nave. Those words are kind of used interchangeably.